The Nile, the longest river in the world. From Lake Victoria to the Mediterranean, it flows over 4,000 miles. On the banks of this great waterway, deep in ancient times, there lived one of the most remarkable civilizations of all history. Their story came to an end 2,000 years ago, yet our knowledge of their life is detailed. The texts they wrote down and the monuments they constructed reveal a nation of mysterious gods, remarkable rulers, and achievements far ahead of their time. This was the nation of ancient Egypt.
Here at Luxor, modern Luxor, on both sides of the river was the great city of ancient Thebes, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. And it was here, the religious capital of the New Kingdom, where most of the great monuments of ancient Egypt were built. Even Homer knew about it. He wrote about it in the Iliad in Book 9. And he speaks of 100-gated Thebes, Egyptian Thebes, wherein the golden ingots gleam. There are great temples on the east bank here, to the living god Amun, temples at Luxor and at Karnak. And over on the west bank, we've got temples of the dead gods, the mortuary temples of the great kings. And hidden away in the Theban hills, there is the Valley of the Kings, where virtually all the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, from about 1570 down to 1085 BC, they were buried in that hidden valley. And of course, the best known one is Tutankhamun.
The birth of Egypt is one of the earliest events of recorded history. Tens of thousands of years ago, the River Nile began to flood annually. These floodwaters, rich in silt from the African interior, produced fertile riverbank land in a region of desert.
The Egyptians' lives was governed by other factors, especially the Nile. The Nile was for them like a huge clock that organized their world. And that's why they had to watch out for it. That's why they had to think in the way of the Nile and the agricultural cycle. That's why when you talk about spring, summer, autumn and winter, you don't find that in ancient Egypt. You find in ancient Egypt inundation, the coming out of the plants, and the so-called summer, 3 seasons.
By the 4th millennium BC, the Nile's banks were extensively populated. Primarily, these people were farmers. They grew fruit and arable crops. They reared livestock and cast nets into the Nile for fish. Trade and craft were also practiced. Pottery from the age has survived perfectly intact. Many of the world's museums include examples of Egyptian work well over 5,000 years old. In earliest times, Egypt was divided in two. Lower Egypt was the name given to the marshy land around the Nile Delta. Upper Egypt comprised the dry Nile Valley to the south. This division did not last for long. According to legend, around 3100 BC, the whole of Egypt was united under one ruler, King Menes.
Egypt became a unified state at about the end of the 4th millennium, but we don't know exactly how this came about, and we no longer believe that there was a single king who did this. There appear to have been a number of small states in Egypt, mainly spread through the Nile Valley, and the culture of the Nile Valley conquered the culture of the Delta, and after that there came to be a single state in Egypt. But this was hundreds of years, probably, before the Menes, who is essentially a figure of legend. We don't know if such a person really existed or not.
By the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, Egypt was ruled by hereditary monarchs, the first of the pharaohs. For the next 3,000 years, the pharaohs were the rulers of the land of Egypt. Their names have survived through the ages, most of them obscure, some of them well known to this day.
The term pharaoh first appears in Greek historical writers of the 3rd century BC, and it's a way of rendering the Egyptian words per-a'a, which means roughly something like great house. And it's a way of describing the monarchy in terms of the physical space that it inhabits. So rather in the same way that Britons talk about 10 Downing Street when they mean the British government, so Egyptians talked about the per-a'a when they meant the kingship. But it's important to say that pharaohs themselves never refer to themselves as per-a'a. It's a convenient sort of piece of shorthand. The pharaohs always refer to themselves by their elaborate 5-fold titles, of which per-a'a is not part.
Since Roman times, this long list of monarchs has been classified by dynasties, successions of pharaohs with a strong family connection. These dynasties are further classified into periods and kingdoms. The kingdoms represent the greatest ages of Egyptian history. The first of these, the Old Kingdom, began with the 3rd dynasty in the 27th century BC. It was based south of present-day Cairo at the ancient city of Memphis. There is no doubting the greatest achievement of the Old Kingdom pharaohs, since they can still be wondered at today. They are the geometrically designed monuments that will forever be associated with Egypt, the pyramids. Constructed as tombs for the kings who commissioned them, their continuing survival is testimony to the power of the pharaohs. The first of the pyramids was the so-called Step Pyramid, built for the 3rd dynasty pharaoh Zor at Saqqara. Not long afterwards, at Giza, the greatest of all the pyramids was constructed. This is the pyramid of the 4th dynasty pharaoh Cheops. Originally 481 feet high, it was the biggest ever built. Completed in the 26th century BC, it remained the tallest building in the world until the 19th century AD. The adjoining pyramids of Khephren and Mycerinus are scarcely less impressive. Built from massive bricks of cut stone, a material pioneered in Egypt, they remain true wonders of the ancient world. As well as the sheer awe which pyramids like these continue to inspire, their existence is significant in historical terms. They prove that, during the Old Kingdom, Egypt was a land of prosperity. They also prove that the Egyptians were possessed with remarkable administrative skills. The numbers of workers involved in the pyramid's construction ran into tens of thousands. A huge number of men were also needed in the south of the country to work at the stone quarries. To organize such a workforce would be a challenge in the modern world. These great tombs also demonstrate a vital and enduring feature of Egyptian life, the importance of making provision for death.
The Egyptians view death and the beyond very much as a replication of life on Earth. So what you want to achieve in the afterlife is very much what you've got here on Earth. So that means having the same kind of physical status, having the same office, for instance, the same job, and so on. And it also means moving about between the world of the dead and the world of the living in a way that's perhaps rather difficult for us to understand, I think, because we regard these as rather separate spheres, whereas the Egyptians regarded them as something much more closely linked. So it's possible for the living to write letters to the dead asking them for specific favours, and the Egyptians certainly believed that the dead have the power to grant those favours. So it's both a continuation of life on Earth, but also it's a life which enters into a rather kind of special dimension that we don't really have a concept for. As for the kind of provisions they make for themselves to ensure a smooth journey into the afterlife, obviously the optimum one is the tomb, because that's the place where you will be reborn and where the cyclical process of rebirth goes on, because the Egyptians don't believe that you are just reborn once, but that you continue to be reborn in accordance with the way that the sun rises and sets as well. So you don't just have one rebirth, you have many, many. And you need to have an appropriate space for that to happen, and the tomb is the main provision that they have for the afterlife and to assure their rebirth.
The Egyptians believed in the concept of a life force, a spiritual component of existence, whose most important aspect was the ka. In the Egyptian belief system, the ka was a duplicate of the physical body which continued to live after death. However, for the ka to survive, the physical body also needed to survive. By entombing the corpse within an enormous, apparently secure structure such as a pyramid, it was intended that it would be preserved for all eternity. To prevent the body's decomposition, the Egyptians pioneered a preservation technique that is also forever associated with their civilization, the technique of mummification.
What would happen would be that the body of the deceased would be opened up and the interior organs would be removed and the brain would be removed from the head, and the heart in some cases would be put back into the body but no other part. So basically you would have an empty body cavity, although it would have its wall and so on, and then it would be dried out by being packed in natron. Natron is a naturally occurring salt which will desiccate the body, and once it had been dried out, it would then be treated with various sweet-smelling oils, resins and things like that, and it would be wrapped in a huge amount of linen. And during all of this time, which typically would take 70 days, there would be rituals performed as the whole process occurred. And then finally, at the end, the body would be put into a coffin, and perhaps into a nest of coffins, into several coffins, one inside another, and would be buried. But the internal organs that were taken out of the body were placed in separate containers, which are known as canopic jars, and there they were preserved in liquids, in oils and resins. And so a properly mummified body would consist both of the mummy itself and of the set of canopic jars.
To the Egyptians, the beginnings of mummification were explained in mythological terms with the death of the god Osiris at the hands of his brother Seth. To prevent the survival of his spirit, Seth dismembered his brother's corpse. However, Osiris's widow, Isis, succeeded in gathering together her husband's remains and successfully mummified them. Osiris then became the ruler of the underworld. In the Egyptian pantheon, both Osiris and Isis were grandchildren of the supreme deity, the god of the sun, Ra. Like other Egyptian gods, Ra was depicted pictorially with a human body and an animal's head, in his case, a hawk. He was also symbolized by the sun disk and the obelisk. Throughout Egyptian history, Ra remained far and away the most important of the many gods worshipped at the time. The obelisks that survive, both in Egypt and elsewhere, are testimony to his durability. The Egyptian system of worship is a subject which can be difficult to comprehend fully. It never developed into a theologically founded religion in the modern sense. The sheer number of different divinities recorded can be bewildering. In part, this complexity stems from the existence of localized gods. Individual communities worship their own individual deities. Each community had 9 gods, headed by the 3 most important. These were known as triads, a divine threesome of man, wife, and child. At Thebes, in Central Egypt, the local gods were Amun, his wife Mut, and their son Khons. These gods would prove to be especially important because the city that worshipped them came to be important.
The first 6 dynasties are the Old Kingdom, and then we have an intermediate period, a dark age, when the central authority broke down, and that started about 2180 BC. And then at the end of the first intermediate period, as we call it, princes here at Thebes rose and they took over the country, and we have the great Middle Kingdom, the 11th and 12th dynasties, with the temple here at Deir el-Bahri of the king Amenhotep, who begins it all. But again it collapsed, unfortunately, at the end of the 12th dynasty. We have a second intermediate period, and then after that dark age, round about 1570 BC, begins the high water mark of ancient Egyptian history, the New Kingdom, the dynasties 18 to 20, when we've got all the famous names.
During the first of these 2 great ages, the Theban pharaohs of the 12th dynasty presided over a 200-year period of prosperity. However, this period marks the end of one of Egypt's most famous activities. From the end of the 19th century BC, the practice of pyramid building simply died out. Despite the end of pyramid building, Egyptian concern with the preservation of the dead remained as important as ever during the Middle Kingdom. Large-scale building projects also continued. One of the finest surviving architectural relics in the whole of Egypt was begun around this time. Built on the east bank of the Nile at the new capital of Thebes, the Temple of Karnak grew into a massive complex of buildings that are still appreciated today.
The temple complexes of Luxor and Karnak are the most symbolically important religious structures in Egypt. And once the religious capital moves to Luxor at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, then all the pharaohs of the 18th and 19th and 20th dynasties as well invest in building projects there. So it's a process of constant accretion, rather like medieval cathedrals, I think, whereby individuals would add a chapel here and an aisle there to an already large religious structure. And the temples eventually become quite huge. The whole of the east bank of the Nile around the Luxor area eventually becomes one huge sacral complex, which also links into the temples on the other side of the Nile too. So it's not just linked to the east bank, they also have links with the temples at Deir el-Bahri and Deir el-Medina on the east. So we could think about the whole area being one huge temple complex, not just Luxor and Karnak.
The Karnak temple complex covers an area of approximately 1 square mile and was constructed and modified over a period of 1,500 years. Its courts, temples, obelisks, pylons and sanctuaries made it unrivaled throughout Egypt. It provides a massive physical expression of the dominance of the Theban triad of gods. The temple enclosure of Amun is the central feature of the complex. By entering the enclosure via an avenue of ram-headed sphinxes, the modern visitor is transported back in time.
Here in the temple of Amun at Karnak, there are many inscriptions which tell us about the great conquests of the pharaohs like Ramesses III, Seti I and so on, and we can actually see the names of the cities they conquered written here in hieroglyphs, and you see there's a captive on the top there, and we know immediately that these are Semitic. They are from Syria. There are other examples where we have Nubians from the south of Egypt. So the whole list of the conquered cities is inscribed here for everyone to read on the walls, to know about the great king.
The massive area of the Great Court contains a reminder of the spiritual purpose of the building. This is the chapel of Pharaoh Seti II, containing spaces for images of the 3 Theban divinities, Amun in the centre, Mut on the left, and Khons on the right. Seti II was a pharaoh from the New Kingdom, the third great period of Egyptian history, and most of the great construction work at Karnak stems from that period.
The hypostyle hall in the Temple of Karnak is what people think of as the most impressive part of it. It's a columned hall which has nearly 150 columns in it, and it was constructed at a date which is not quite certain, but probably about 1300 BC. It's possible that the columns which form the centre of it are a little bit older, but there's dispute about that. So the hypostyle hall is essentially the largest interior space in the temple, which also had a certain amount of light because the central columns were taller than the side columns and there were windows in the space between the two heights. It is an extraordinarily impressive place to visit, but it has a very strange feature to the modern eye, which is that there are effectively no sight lines through it. You can look straight down the centre, but you can't look across it because of the forest of columns. But in ancient Egypt, they did not use arches to span spaces in stone, and so they could not set the columns more than a certain distance apart. So if you wished to roof a very large space in stone, that was how you did it. And it has this very impressive but rather seemingly strange appearance to us now. And one must remember that the interiors of temples in Egypt were broadly not visited by the public. And so this enormous space was there to impress the god by the lavishness of what the king did for him, and by the people because they knew that this enormous structure had been put up for the god, but the people themselves wouldn't visit it.
The magnificent pillars of the great hypostyle hall were commissioned by the pharaoh Amenhotep III, an 18th dynasty king from the 14th century BC. The same dynasty also produced this superb obelisk, one of two originally built. 100 feet high, it was built by Hatshepsut, the first queen of Egypt to become a pharaoh in her own right.
Here beside the sacred lake, we've got a fallen obelisk, one of the two which Queen Hatshepsut, the great queen who ruled alone at the beginning of the 15th century BC, she erected it, and here we see her on the obelisk dressed as a king with the king's crown, and she is with, as she described him, her father, the god Amun. Fortunately, the obelisk has fallen so that we can see clearly the queen's features and her cartouche, which reads over there, Mart Ka Ra. That is her personal name.
Her power is made obvious not only by this, the tallest surviving obelisk in the whole of Egypt, but, more memorably, on the other side of the Nile from Karnak. This is her mortuary temple, a building that proves that the importance of death for the Egyptians did not die out with the pyramids. Approached by a wide roadway, the temple structure is built against the huge limestone cliffs and partly cut from them. It's a remarkable structure with three massive terrace areas defined by impressive colonnading. The massive ramp between the first and second levels is not only simple and practical, but adds to the drama of the whole structure, while the relief sculptures depict events from the life of the pharaoh queen. This enormous monument was only rediscovered in the modern age. It represents possibly the greatest ever excavation work by the 19th century archaeologist Auguste Mariette. Much of our knowledge of ancient Egypt is the result of archaeological research. The 19th century saw the beginnings of large-scale archaeological work in Egypt. Thanks to the excavations of men like Auguste Mariette, Giovanni Belzoni, John Gardner Wilkinson, Flinders Petrie, and Howard Carter, we now possess a wealth of knowledge of the 3,000 years of Egyptian history, and excavations continue to this day. Our knowledge of ancient Egypt is enhanced immeasurably by the ability of modern scholars to understand Egyptian hieroglyphic texts. Before the 19th century, the ability to read this strange pictorial language had been completely lost. It was only thanks to the discovery of one famous slab of stone that these mysterious images at last were able to give up their meaning. It became known after the place where it was found, the Rosetta Stone. This world-famous artifact was discovered in 1799 at Rosetta in northern Egypt. Made of basalt, it was dug up by a French soldier, a member of Napoleon's Egyptian forces. An early French archaeological party was also in Egypt at the same time, and it soon became apparent that this was a significant find.
Now, the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799 in Egypt. It is a decree dated to 196 BC, which is inscribed in Egyptian, in the form of hieroglyphs, and Egyptian Demotic, which is an everyday form of the language, and also in Greek. And so it gave the opportunity to compare the hieroglyphic script with Greek, which was known. And on the basis of the Rosetta Stone, it was possible to suggest values for some of the hieroglyphs and eventually to decipher the language. The person who did it was Jean-François Champollion in 1822. He published not a reading of the whole Rosetta Stone, but a reading of important names that occurred on it, principally names like the names of the Ptolemies themselves. From there, he was able to continue to decipher other Egyptian hieroglyphs and hence to move into understanding the Egyptian language as a whole.
The ability to read Egyptian texts, whether on relief sculptures or papyrus scrolls, has enabled a wealth of detail to emerge about Egyptian history and life. We now know why many of the relief images of Hatshepsut carved in her great temple appear to have been damaged deliberately. It was part of a campaign by her successor, Pharaoh Thutmose III. Hatshepsut was the widow of Pharaoh Thutmose II, and when he died, they had produced no heir. The succession then passed to a young boy, son of one of the late king's concubines. As a minor, Hatshepsut ruled as regent, but her authority was such that the nominal male ruler had to wait until her death 20 years later to ascend the throne. Filled with bitterness and jealousy, the eventual Pharaoh Thutmose II set about destroying the Pharaoh Queen's legacy. This ancient tale explains the damage to the relief images at Hatshepsut's temple. We also know that Thutmose sought to obscure the great obelisks built by his predecessor. Having constructed a pillared hypostyle hall round them, he then surrounded the obelisks with a giant sandstone structure so that only their pinnacle stood out from above it. In later times, however, the obscuring stone was removed, and Hatshepsut's great monument can still be seen today beside the sacred lake just 50 yards south of its first location. The waters of this small lake were used by the temple priests before carrying out important rituals in honor of the god Amun.
Karnak Temple has a sacred lake because boats are very important in the cult of the gods that took place in that temple. What this revolved around was the processions of the cult image of the god, which were carried around actually on large-scale boats on the shoulders of the priests. And these boats would also be launched on the sacred lake in the temple, so it would be used for that. And it all ties in with the way that the sacred boat that the divine image is carried on is a reflection of the boat in which the sun travels in its journey around the earth.
The lake is a reminder of the spiritual purpose of the temple, the worship of Amun and the Theban triad. Of all the ceremonies carried out in their honor, there was none more important than the Opet festival. Once a year, at the time of the Nile flood, the images of Amun, Mut, and Khons would be taken down the river to the second great temple at Thebes, the Temple of Luxor. Like the Temple of Karnak, the construction of the Temple of Luxor was carried on over a period of centuries. Modifications to it were still being made in Roman times. Its initial structure was built by the great 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep III, and his work can still be admired. The 14 columns that make up his colonnade are one of the most dramatic features of the temple. Next to this is a great court, also constructed by Amenhotep. Studded with columns, religious processions would have passed through here, on through the hypostyle hall, into the sacred chapels of the temple.
The Temple of Luxor is much less expansive than Karnak. It's in size, it was more than 300 meters long from top to bottom. And I say top to bottom because it is oriented north-south and not east-west like Karnak. Luxor faces towards Karnak, and it was a very major temple which was constructed probably as a seasonal sanctuary that was used for particular rituals relating to what happened with the king in particular, and when the god of Karnak, Amun-Re, would visit the temple of Luxor. The Luxor temple probably dates to the New Kingdom, to maybe it was begun about 1500 BC, and its main expansion then was in the mid-14th century, shall we say about 1370, that sort of date, and then again under Ramesses II from about 1279 onwards. And then in the Roman period, very interestingly, it was made into a sanctuary for the cult of the Roman emperor in the 3rd century AD. So this idea that it was commonly associated with the king evidently survived about 2,000 years. But it's a much more limited development than you had at Karnak. Finally, there was built between Luxor and Karnak a processional alley, which in the late period in the 4th century BC was made into an alley with sphinxes on either side the whole way between the two temples. So at that date, Luxor as a whole, the city of Luxor, was a ceremonial space where there were these processional ways which defined the whole city.
When admiring Amenhotep's architecture at Luxor, it's reasonable for the modern visitor to consider the true purpose of his work. Was it to honor the great god Amun or the great pharaoh Amenhotep? There is no doubt that Amenhotep was especially keen to be remembered through the building of physical monuments. This can be clearly seen with the statues known as the Colossi of Memnon, situated nearby on the west bank of the Nile. 60 feet high, these massive seated figures are all that remains of his mortuary temple. Well over 3,000 years after the death of their builder, these giant faceless figures survive as a reminder of his rule over Egypt. We know that Amenhotep's reign was a glorious age for his nation. For almost 40 years, he presided over a period of prosperity, while his diplomatic skills meant it was also a period of peace. There's no doubt that Amenhotep III was one of the greatest of pharaohs. The survival of the Colossi of Memnon and the Temple of Luxor can be seen as dramatic testimony to the wisdom of his rule. His status was also reflected in more human ways during his lifetime. His harem was said to be 300 strong. Visitors to the Temple of Luxor cannot fail to be reminded of another great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. Next to Amenhotep's colonnade, this king constructed an extension to the original temple. At its entrance is a pylon over 75 feet in height. Beside this, he erected not only a superb pink granite obelisk, but statues of himself almost equally impressive. These are the images of the pharaoh some consider the greatest of them all, a 19th dynasty king whose rule took up 67 years of the 13th century BC. His name is familiar to many people with only the slightest knowledge of ancient Egypt. This is an image of Ramesses II.
Ramesses II is one of those unique characters that you meet in history. He wanted so many things, and funnily enough, he achieved them. He wanted to live a long life. He lived for over 80 years, probably even 90. He wanted to rule for a long time. He ruled for at least 67 years. He wanted to be known as a warrior king. He was a warrior king. He fought at least for the first 20 years in his career as a king. I wouldn't say that he was the greatest strategist that Egypt ever produced. Compared to Thutmose III, he was really second rate. Nevertheless, he is more famous than Thutmose II as a warrior. Ramesses II is one of the very, very few characters who left his stamp, not only in ancient Egypt, but in the ancient world. He is known and was known throughout the ancient Near East. He was known in Syria, Palestine. He was known in Asia Minor. He had a treaty in Asia with the Hittites, who were in Asia Minor.
By 1258 BC, he'd secured a peace with his enemies, which lasted for the remaining 46 years of his reign. In that time, he conducted a staggering program of building work dedicated to his own glory. On the west bank of the Nile, he built an imposing mortuary temple now known as the Ramesseum. Though in poor repair now, it was once dominated by a statue of Ramesses well over 50 feet high. It's perhaps unsurprising that Ramesses also sought to extend the Temple of Luxor. Beyond the huge pylon, he built a great court adjoining the original structure. Here, the spiritual meaning of the temple is represented by a small temple dedicated to the Theban triad. In the context of the magnificent court, it appears almost insignificant. It is the glory of Ramesses that is expressed here. Across from the familiar rows of columns are yet more statues of the pharaoh. In modern terms, we might call this evidence of a personality cult. For a civilization whose rulers were often considered to be living gods, it would not have appeared unusual.
The relationship of the pharaoh with the gods in ancient Egypt was terribly important because the ancient Egyptians viewed Pharaoh as being a god on earth. He was, in fact, the embodiment of the god Horus, who is the son of Osiris, the god of the dead. And so quite often in the reliefs, we see him being nursed on the lap of a goddess or even being suckled by her. And then again, we see him as a god offering to the gods, offering flowers, pots of water, wine, etc. And then in return also we see the gods, such as Horus himself, giving the breath of life, the Ankh sign, touching the pharaoh's lips. So the gods give Pharaoh life upon earth, although he himself is a representative of them for his own people. Everything that the ancient Egyptians wanted came from the gods through the pharaoh, the god on earth.
For all his near divinity, enough is known of Ramesses II's long and fruitful life to confirm his essential humanity. Like Amenhotep before him, he enjoyed the physical pleasures of life. It's recorded that he fathered 100 sons. He may have had as many as 90 wives. After his death in 1212 BC, his mummified body was entombed in a concealed, narrow valley across the river from Luxor. For virtually the whole of the New Kingdom period, this was the final resting place for Egypt's pharaohs, the Valley of the Kings. Here, elaborate tombs were cut into the rock and then sealed. It was hoped that this would provide better protection from tomb robbers than the massively public pyramid tombs. It was a forlorn hope. With one astonishing exception, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings would all fall victim to the thieves.
There were at least 62 tombs in the Valley of the Kings, but not all of these were for pharaohs themselves, and some of them we can't even identify. They're not inscribed, so we don't know who was originally buried in them. But probably something like upwards of 20 pharaohs were originally buried there, most of the kings from the beginning of the 18th dynasty to the end of the 19th. And the reason for burying them in this particular area is that it's perceived, its religious landscape is perceived to be particularly sacred. It's presided over by a shrine of the goddess Hathor, who is the goddess who presides over the post-mortem transitions, the processes of rebirth. And it's the whole area is perceived to have had what anthropologists call a noumen, a kind of spiritual power that the place itself is imbued with.
When archaeologists began to investigate the Valley of the Kings during the 19th century, they discovered elaborately decorated tombs stripped of their treasures. In 1817, Giovanni Belzoni discovered the tomb of the 19th dynasty pharaoh Seti I. The wonderful decoration of the tomb walls had survived. The funerary treasures had long since been taken, as had the pharaoh's mummy. Remarkably, the mummy was eventually discovered in 1881 in a mortuary temple just half a mile away. For reasons unknown, Seti's body had been moved there along with 39 other royal mummies. These included Seti I's son and successor as pharaoh, Ramesses II. Over 3,000 years after his long and glorious reign, we can still look upon the facial features of possibly the greatest pharaoh of them all. If Ramesses II is the greatest pharaoh of them all, he may not be the most famous of them all. For many people, that honor falls to one of his new kingdom predecessors. This was a king who died young, but whose death prompted the creation of one of the most stupendous objects ever created. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings was the last to be discovered in 1922 by the British archaeologist Howard Carter. The tomb itself was unremarkable. What was remarkable was that its contents had survived the centuries intact. It was the tomb of Tutankhamun.
This is the entrance to the tomb of Tutankhamun here in the Valley of the Kings. The smallest royal tomb in the valley. It's only 4 very small rooms. The most well-known tomb, of course, since it was found virtually intact by Howard Carter in 1922. It had been hidden, the entrance to it, at the bottom of 16 steps in the Valley of the Kings here. And curiously, with all the great pharaohs round about that have been robbed long ago, the wealth in this tomb is unbelievable. All the world knows about it. And yet Tutankhamun was a small king, very little known, reigned for only 9 years. He was nearly 18 when he died. He was 17 years old, nearly at his 18th birthday. And yet, for all the other great pharaohs buried here, Ramesses II, Thutmose III, his name is still the one that all the public know.
The discovery of the treasures of Tutankhamun is possibly the best-known archaeological achievement ever. Inside the tomb, Howard Carter and his team discovered the sarcophagus of the boy pharaoh. Contained within it was a magnificent golden coffin, a coffin which seemed unusually heavy. The reason for this was to become apparent. It was merely an outer coffin. Inside it was another, but the weight of this container still seemed excessive. Eventually, the time came for Howard Carter to open the second coffin. At that moment, the most fabulous of ancient treasure revealed itself. It was the third coffin, in the image of the pharaoh whose body it contained, Pharaoh Tutankhamun. The reaction of Carter and his colleagues upon seeing this object for the first time can only be imagined. It's made of 296 pounds of solid gold. Inside it was the body of the king, along with a gold death mask that is now one of the best-known objects on Earth. It was the find of a lifetime.
It's often said that if Tutankhamun's tomb represents the kind of burial that a relatively unimportant pharaoh would have had, then surely the burials of important pharaohs like Amenhotep III or Ramesses II must have been even more magnificent. But I don't think that's quite right, because Tutankhamun is buried at a time of great political upheaval. He's buried after the period of religious reform known as the Amarna period, when normal ways of interring pharaohs seem to be suspended. So I think that Tutankhamun's tomb is probably more lavish than those of some of the other pharaohs, although we don't know because none of them really has survived. And people have done research onto aspects of the burial, such as comparing the thickness of the gold foil used on Tutankhamun's burial with pieces that we know to have survived from the burials of other pharaohs. And Tutankhamun's gold foil is actually thicker. So it seems as though there may have been more money expended on his burial to mark the return to religious orthodoxy and the ways that pharaohs normally were buried.
It's no exaggeration to say that these treasures have imprinted themselves upon the consciousness of humanity. When they were displayed at the British Museum in 1972, over 1.5 million people came to admire and wonder. It was that museum's most successful exhibition ever. Perhaps more than any other objects, these treasures conjure up a specific image of Egypt, an image of a magical nation, a nation of living gods and fabulous wealth that flourished while Europe languished in the Bronze Age. Treasures like this make it difficult to avoid a romantic approach when thinking about ancient Egypt. Egypt would survive long after Tutankhamun's brief life in the 14th century BC. The new kingdom to which Tutankhamun belonged would, however, be the last of the great kingdoms of Egyptian dynasties. The final millennium of Egypt's history would see more and more foreign interferences in its affairs. Libyans, Assyrians and Persians all dominated for periods before the forces of Alexander the Great conquered the country in 332 BC. Shortly after, the 32nd and final dynasty was established. This was a time of increasing Greek influence in Egyptian life, when the country was ruled by the successors of Ptolemy and their sister wives called Cleopatra. It was also a time of increasing pressure from Rome, and it was this pressure that would eventually prove the end for Egypt. The suicide of the final Cleopatra in 30 BC marks the end of the 3,000-year history of the rule of the pharaohs. They would never be restored, but their legacy lives on in the treasures, the texts, and the monuments that they left behind.
Near the end of the last century, one of the greatest English professors who was working in Sinai discovered a script which looked hieroglyphic. It was pictures, but nobody was able to read it. They found out that this was the first Semitic text that was written in hieroglyphic writings, but wasn't used according to the Egyptian system of writing. For their amazement, this was the beginning of alphabet. So whenever an Englishman is having his morning cup of tea and reading his newspaper, he should know that he owes his readings to an ancient Egyptian writer whose name wouldn't even know.